What's going on? Welcome to another show, the Research to Reps Roundtable. I'm your co-host, Dr. Coach Pat Ivy, and with me are Dr. Ted Lambrinides and Dr. Ernie Reimer. But I want to say hi to Dr. Ted first. What's going on, Ted?
I'm doing great, Pat. Yourself?
I'm doing fantastic. Dr. Reimer, what's happening, Ernie?
I am doing just swell. Thank you, Dr. Ivy. Today we have a very special guest, and to introduce Dr. Stacy Sims, I just want to share a little story. Circa summer of 2018, perhaps it was 2019, had a sports science intern named Sam Moore come out and spend her summer with me. And Dr. Sims did a blind mock interview with Sam. And when Sam got there, she first of all made sure that I knew that women do have periods, and we do need to acknowledge that in the sports setting. And then she proceeded to teach me all about periods for the rest of the summer that she was with me, and has gone on to do some research of her own for women's health and performance. And Stacy, thank you for coming on the show today. You've been such a role model for other researchers out there focused on women's health and performance issues. How are you doing today?
I'm good. Thank you very much. And then to follow on with Sam, we shared the stage at the Female Athlete Health Conference this past June, talking about some of her research in menopause, and then I followed up with some of my stuff. So yeah, it was really good to have the young and old together sharing the stage.
That is really cool that you two got to do that.
Yeah.
Well, I'll go ahead and start off if you all don't mind. I have a question. Dr. Sims, Stacy,
Yeah.
tell us a little bit about yourself and give us some reasoning behind your passion and your why for the research that you do.
Okay, so I guess I'll start with the passion and the why, because that's easier than all the other stuff. Passion and the why is because I've always been the person that asks why, but also background growing up as an Army brat and having exposure to different cultures, seeing a lot of inequities just in that hierarchy of just what exists in the military, the hierarchy of command, but seeing a discrepancy between I'm a girl, my sister, my mom, but not seeing a lot of female soldiers. And so that's interesting. So just kind of growing up with the context aware that there wasn't a lot of women involved in things that a lot of men were. And then when I was a teenager, my dad was like, "Oh, what do you want to do?" And I was like, "I want to be a SEAL or a Ranger." And he's like, "Well, you can't." I was like, "What do you mean I can't?" He's like, "Well, you can't because women aren't allowed." And that was kind of the first time where I was like, wait, just because I'm a woman, that means that I can't do something I want to do. And then that led me into going to university and having that exposure of all the textbooks and all the PDFs and everything that you're learning is always a reference man. And there wasn't any kind of identification that I'm a woman and I'm being represented in the stuff that I'm being taught. So it's just a whole bunch of things that came to the drive of why I do what I do, is because I wanted to know more about women and female athletes, and I wanted to have that equality. And then as we get further and further into the historical concept of sports science and biomedical research, seeing that it's always been defaulted to the male, wait, that doesn't represent all of these other people that want to perform at their best or are having issues and need these issues to be solved. Yeah, so that's my brief background of why.
Thank you.
I got a question that has been brought up, and we look at, say, strength differences between male and female athletes, and if we look at differences between lower body and upper body, and sometimes we're looking at not physiological differences, but perhaps sociological differences. For instance, when you have young boys and young girls playing, a lot of times the girls are discouraged from, hey, no, you shouldn't really be climbing that tree. No, you really shouldn't be, doing that. And so sometimes some of the adaptations that normally would occur, regardless, if you didn't have some of those barriers or some of the women have had to overcome in certain situations, that we might see a lot less differences than what appears in the literature. And what are your thoughts on some of that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I'm sitting across the street from the primary school and the high school, and I see a lot of the stuff that happens at the primary school or elementary school. My daughter goes there. And there's a lot of like when they're younger, you see them all intermixing and playing and pushing on the soccer field and playing on the monkey bars. And then there's this like subtle difference when they hit like fourth grade, fifth grade, where all of a sudden the boys are taking over the soccer field. There's no place for the girls to play. The girls aren't jumping in. And then you come to find out that they're getting pushback of, well, you can't play because you're a girl. Well, what does that mean? So there's this inherent pushback still. And then the other thing that I often question is the protocols, right? So if we think about protocols for young kids who are doing like soccer and stuff when they're, I don't know, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, kind of in that early to puberty years, and you see a drop off, a lot of people are like, oh, well, it's because the girls feel ungangly or their period starts or whatever it is. But it's really because of this inability for people to understand that boys and girls do have a difference, especially when they're going through puberty. And you start seeing this difference in body mechanics, you start seeing difference in self-efficacy, but no one addresses it. So if they're not getting acknowledged and addressed, it's like talking to the person, right? So if you're talking to the person or understanding where they're coming from, then you can address those issues, but that's not commonplace. So you see girls drop out of sport, they get discouraged, and then they don't get the training history. So then when they want to do sport, when they're in their teenagers, they're kind of on the back foot already. And then that brings us into like, how far behind is coaching protocols? So it's like, well, when was the last time anyone was upskilled on the difference in the biomechanics? And how do we have to teach girls to run and jump and throw and swim and all of these things once they've gone through puberty? None of that happens, right? So then I'm like, okay, and then we come into the strength training. If you're in the gym and you're watching strength training, what kind of techniques and things are you seeing differences with regards to early arm pull and a clean? Because it's been drilled into young boys at an early age because they get into the gym faster and at an earlier age than girls do. So I don't know. What have you guys figured out or been doing differently with athletes?
Okay, Ernie's looking at me because I can tell he's looking at my square on his screen. Something that we have done that's unique here is we have a director of sports medicine for women's health position, and it's in the JDF. It's in the job description, and which is going very well. We also have a huge campaign for it is a women's networking campaign. It's a campaign to generate $10 million that goes towards supporting our female athletes and our women. So from the top, that's really important because that sets the tone. Our chief medical officer is Dr. Jen Daly. We've gone away from the traditional orthopedic model to where our general practitioner, general physician is now the person who's our chief medical officer, leading all of those medical efforts. So I feel like we have really good leadership that is focused on women in sports and our female athletes. And that's important to us. If you look at our population of athletes, you know it as well as we do, the percentages and how many female athletes there are. There has to be more focus from a training perspective, medical perspective. We've made a lot of gains in understanding nutrition, but more needs to be done. Being able to tie in the research with practical application, more needs to be done. I feel like we've got a good start, but that's where we are. We've started and we need to continue the work.
Yeah, I'm getting kind of tired of all the systematic reviews and meta-analyses coming out about female athletes, that we don't have enough research done and the methodology is poor. We've been seeing this for so long. I'm like, we've got to stop parading the problem, man. What are we doing to solve it? So this is one of the first steps, right? It's like really understanding that female athletes need someone that they can talk to about specific female health needs, and they need to feel safe. And if we're doing that from the ground up, then it opens up the want and need to participate in research projects. Because right now we see like women are keen, but not so keen. There's might be some language discrepancies that's kind of pushing people away. So yeah, no, I'm excited to hear that you guys are taking from the top down, and now we're like, okay, let's do grassroots up.
I would ask Ernie that question as well, just from a research and a sports science standpoint. And I can tell you, I get a chance to work with him every day, so I know how important and how intentional he is when it comes to having a diverse group of people around him. So, but I would like to hear his answer to that question as well that you asked.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm in a pretty unique position now, and to be honest, I think we are still learning and becoming more and more aware to be able to do something about this. I think the first time I really started to appreciate the issue, but not necessarily manage the issue as well, would be when I was working at the U.S. ski team. And at the U.S. Olympic ski team, I was in charge of the strength and conditioning for the women's alpine Olympic team. And, you know, when I first interviewed for the job, they had asked me, like, what's your experience like with female athletes and being around women? And I was just like, well, you know, I've been with my partner for a number of years, raised by a single mom, and about 90% of the athletes I currently work with are female. So I feel pretty comfortable working with women. I probably could have given a more elegant response. And while I was there, you know, my whole universe was the female athlete and the female alpine skier. And at that time, I'd been asked to give presentations on how do you train women's alpine and female alpine skiers. And I had a colleague there, and her name was Tashana Breslin, now Tashana Schiller. And Tashana and I worked together at our previous institution prior to the ski team. And she had done a review of literature on the menstrual cycle in the female athlete. And her findings came out that there wasn't a lot to be done around that. So to be honest with you, when I'm presenting on these things, a lot of the things I talked about, like in my success with these athletes, was it was really the interpersonal connection that you start to develop with them, to truly not just go in and tell them what to do and make them and, put them against each other in a competitive training setting. It was more like trying to understand them and what their goals are. But because of that review of lit that Tashana did, I was like, okay, like maybe there's not a whole lot there with the menstrual cycle and training athletes. And that's what I kind of worked with during my years at the ski team. And then when you fast forward to where we started at the beginning of today's episode, when I met Sam, and she started to reveal a lot more of the evidence suggesting that the menstrual cycle does have an impact on training performance and training outcomes, I started to open my eyes to it a lot more. And so my question for you, Dr. Sims, would be like, to go from research down to the rep level, because this is the Research to Reps podcast. Like, if you were to make maybe 3 recommendations to the strength and conditioning coach, and let's even narrow that in, let's say the American strength and conditioning coach who works with female athletes, what are 3 things you think they could do, like tomorrow or next week, to try to provide a better training program and environment for the female athletes they coach?
Yeah, one of the big things that's missing from the sports science research is the more qualitative aspect. Like, we're seeing a lot of stuff coming out about how menstrual cycle symptomology affects training perception, both from a coach and a female athlete. I think the very first thing that needs to be done across the board is menstrual cycle education. Like, what is a normal menstrual cycle? Why do some women have more issues than others? What is heavy menstrual bleeding? What is a normal length of a cycle? What is PCOS? What is endometriosis? Because no one knows about that. And it's going to be a big ask. So if we take it a step back and go, okay, what are some of the 3 things that we can actually implement right away? First and foremost is having your athlete track their own menstrual cycle so they can see their own patterns of the days where they feel really good and not so great. Because when we start to really get that intuitive, I feel great, I don't feel great, aligned with training metrics, we really start to see different patterns of when we can push hard and when we can put in that extra rep, when we can put in a little bit of extra load, when instead of a 2 RIR, we're doing a 1 IRR. So there's lots of things that we can do within it. So it's really interesting when you have a periodized program and there isn't that conversation. So being able to have that conversation with the coach and the athlete, so then the athlete can be like, you know what, I feel flat all the time on this day, 3 days before my period starts. So let's not try to push the load. Let's not try to, hit a PR. Let's see if we can work more on technique, or, try to work with the athlete, because then that empowers the athlete to be like, this is a valid symptom. That's the other conversation that's not being had. And I feel like it's being pushed back, and women are becoming more and more disempowered about their menstrual cycle, because you're hearing all these really siloed sports science people saying there's no effect. When in fact, when you take that personalized qualitative approach, you do. So that's a very first thing, is tracking and having that conversation. I guess those are 2 things. And then the other thing is really making sure that your athlete stays at a low energy availability. So it's that nutrient timing. There was a paper that came out, I think it was even last week, looking at increasing maximum muscle protein synthesis. 15 grams of protein did nothing. We know 20 grams of protein does almost nothing in women. So they're looking at 30 to 60 grams. And at 30 to 60 gram was a window. You didn't get improvement in the longevity of MPS with 60, but 30 was the, I guess, the definitive threshold where you could extend muscle protein synthesis further out and keep women out of that hypothalamic reading of low energy availability. So the top 3 things: getting them to track, have those conversations with you, and making sure that they are really spot on their nutrition, because the recovery aspect for women is different than men. And now we're starting to see that, like with protein doses, with timing, those kinds of things. And timing's really important for women. So that's something else that really needs to be educated in.
Have you noticed a difference whether the female athlete, whether they have a male or a female coach, in terms of the messaging or the recommendations, where if they're encouraged or discouraged from oral contraceptives in the training process?
Yeah, that's not really, it comes from more medical, like what does the team physician say? Had incidences where team physicians like, I'm going to put all the athletes on an oral contraceptive pill because that way they can control their cycle. And so then that education gets passed to the female athlete and also the coach. It's like, wait, that's not controlling the cycle. That's masking everything. So we can't see what's going on. We can't see if there's a misstep in nutrition and training overload or not, if they are adapting or not. It's not about the health, or not about the performance aspect. It's about the health of the athlete. So when we start talking about how many female athletes are using oral contraceptive pill, not for contraception, but to, quote, get a period when it's a withdrawal bleed, and we know that it's not an accurate measurement of endocrine health, or to be able to control their cycle, to manipulate, we don't know for sure if manipulation is a good thing or not, because of the fluctuations of the menstrual cycle. We see there are times where there's better force velocity than not. So if you're on an oral contraceptive pill, are you dampening your ability to adapt to heavier loads or not? So these are some of the things where it's like those conversations aren't being had yet either, because they're so new. But the blatant aspect of women being on oral contraceptive pill in the States is higher than other places. But like in the States, I think it's to 70% of female athletes are on some kind of oral contraceptive pill. In New Zealand and Australia, it's around 20%, because there's been more education down here in the smaller groups in smaller countries, to be able to impact and say, you need to be aware of what your cycle is doing so that we can keep track of endocrine health. If you need contraception, then let's look from a health aspect of what you need and why, not just a blanket here, take a monophasic oral contraceptive pill. Do you guys have a lot of those kinds of issues in where you are? Like all the female athletes want to use an OC, they can manipulate the cycle, they don't have to worry about a bleed. I find that in tactical athletes until they find out they can use an IUD and have very limited bleed, and then they don't have to worry about taking a pill every day.
All right. So let me take a step back and then get to that question. Education, there needs to be a lot more education.
Yes.
For we have our health and performance meetings, we have our team physicians involved, but there needs to be much more education on this topic. Let me ask one question. This is going to take it back to very simple, but then I'll bring it back. How do you help? Everyone needs more education. How do you help the male coaches of female athletes get past not talking about this? Because even in their own houses, they didn't handle these conversations with their daughters. Someone else did. And I could be speaking about someone I know. So how do you help those coaches? What do you say? Do you think that's an issue, a problem? What do you say? How do you help them to get comfortable? Okay, you're a male coach of female athletes. These conversations need to be had. What do you think about that?
So there are two ways of doing it, depending on how open the coach is. So we can look at it as the first and foremost is every time an athlete comes into the gym to see you for a training session, you in general, you have kind of a checklist, kind of a check-in in the day. Are you injured? How did you sleep? Are you fueled? Like what's going on? Just to kind of have that whole body scan check before a training session starts. And in that, we can put another question in there, like, how are you feeling about where are you in your menstrual cycle? How do you feel today based on that? So it just becomes a health question, just a full body scan health questions. Slot it in there with all the other ones. So it's expected, it's in context. And that's how we can start the conversation. And then the other way to do it is using technology. So we have all these different apps where people are using to look at like Wild AI is one, Flow is another, Hello Clue. But Wild AI is designed by female athletes for female athletes to be able to track their cycle and their symptomology. And it's driven by artificial intelligence. So then the female athlete will get information back the more they put in there. But the other thing about it is it has a coaching platform. So a coach can have this and be like, okay, where is my athlete in their cycle without actually directly having that conversation? Fitter Woman is another one that has the same kind of coaching platform. So as a coach, you're inviting your athletes in. So all the stuff that they're putting in their app can come up on your dashboard. So you can see symptomology, you can see their readiness for training. You see where they are in their menstrual cycle if they're having any issues. So then it kind of takes the onus off that opening up that conversation to being like, this is just part of the coaching process. So it's embracing some of the newer tech or being a little bit more, I don't really mean it in a bad way when I say it, but old school, because I'm that way. I want to have that conversation with the person and check in and find the face-to-face, how are you feeling? How ready are you for training today instead of looking at a screen? So I always thought of it as a health question.
All right. So I'll answer your question and then I want to ask you a question.
Yeah.
In terms of oral contraception, we have let our team physicians and our sports medicine staff handle that. And they make that decision. I'm not aware that in our health and performance meetings that we are discussing that. I could be wrong. Ernie, he's in more of those meetings, but I don't believe we're having those discussions in our health and performance meetings, meaning where the nutritionist, the sports scientist, the strength and conditioning coach, the mental health, mental performance team physician. I don't believe that is happening. I don't believe we're discussing oral contraception amongst that group. But you are obviously bringing up some very good points. This is something that we probably should be discussing in those meetings.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be like so-and-so is using this. It could be like a percentage of athletes are using oral contraceptive pill because they have specific health issues. So we need to watch out for that. And as a physician, they'd be watching out. If there's a certain amount of athletes that are on an IUD or they've been identified with heavy menstrual bleeding, it's just saying, hey, you know, we have this selection of athletes. We know that some of them have heavy menstrual bleeding, some of them have issues where they're using an IUD, and then some are using an OC. So just making the coaches aware that there's this different combination, that all the really specific nuances of what that health condition is stays with the medical. But it's just making people in the room aware of what's going on. So if they start to see discrepancies or they start seeing like a lot of side effects or complaints from the athletes, then the coach is aware that, hey, wait, this might be because they've just started a new OC, or, you know, they might be having more health issues. So then you can say, well, are you all right? Do you need to make an appointment to see the physician or something like that? So it's that communication and just that basic knowledge that keeps those conversations flowing so an athlete doesn't fall through the cracks.
Thank you. This is fascinating. And so my question is, and you mentioned it when you were talking about the app that can give you a readiness score. So can you talk about readiness, the menstrual cycle, the force velocity curve, and what does that mean for training programs?
Yeah, so I'll start with the force velocity. So we're seeing a lot of newer neuromuscular research is coming out looking at natural cycle versus oral contraceptive driven cycle. So we know that an OC driven cycle is a continuous hormonal profile for the 3 weeks of the active pill. But for each subsequent week they're on it, they get more and more, I guess, residual metabolites from those hormones. So it accrues into a more high hormone state. We're looking at the natural cycle because you have times of really low estrogen, progesterone. You have times for ovulation of isolated estrogen surge. Then you have times of lower estrogen, higher progesterone. So there's lots of different flux, right? So what we're seeing in the neuromuscular research is when estrogen is in isolation and low, we have better nerve conduction. Because if we're thinking about how estrogen affects the muscle, we know specifically that, I mean, everyone hears estrogen is women's testosterone. So it's basal cell stimulation for muscle protein synthesis. But the other aspect is estrogen is tightly tied to how myosin and actin bond. So we're looking for a very strong muscle contraction. When we see times when estrogen is elevated, there's a stronger muscle contraction. We see a delay in the fatigue with EMG. We see a faster response from the EMG when women are right around ovulation. Estrogen is also responsible for how much acetylcholine is held in the vesicles by the gap junction. So nerve conduction coming down pops the gap junction to stimulate muscle contraction. So times of elevated estrogen, there's more acetylcholine available for faster jump through that nerve conduction. So this is where we're seeing a faster firing rate. We're seeing a stronger muscle contraction. So from a training perspective, knowing when you have this estrogen surge, and it has nothing to do with ovulation because it happens before ovulation, estrogen surge, in the lead up to that estrogen surge and the transient 36 to 48 hours with this elevated estrogen, it's time where you could really work on the the fast firing dynamic. So is it power, is it speed, is it drills? Because we're thinking about training and training adaptation, it's how much stress on the day can your body handle? What is that stress and overcoming that stress? So if we're looking at that, then we can look at what kind of training we're doing in our periodized program. And although we know a lot of women have anovulatory cycles, like I said, it doesn't have anything to do with ovulation because you're still going to have that estrogen surge, whether or not you ovulate. Then when we look at the OC, we don't have that because we have that continuous pattern. And in fact, by the third week of the active pill, it's very much a degradation because you have so much accumulation of estrogen and progesterone, it kind of flatlines. We don't see this ability to increase or decrease the firing rate. What we are seeing, though, is the progestin component of the oral contraceptive pill can indicate how much that firing pattern happens. So understanding, like if we get into the weeds, understanding what generation progestin is in that OC can also impact training. But this is a newer area of research that still, like, people are still digging in to figure out. So that was the velocity curve. What were the other ones? Because I got off on a tangent.
That was good. It was training programs, force velocity curve, maybe velocity-based training. It's called kind of,
intermixed.
Yeah.
So this is where we're looking at if a woman understands how her cycle affects her, but also has the education to know that just because you're on your bleed doesn't mean you can't do stuff, because that's the prevailing conversation outside of, well, even in sports science, that if you're on your bleed phase, that you're a delicate flower and you shouldn't be doing stuff. But we're seeing, with the reduction of hormones, it's more of a change in our immune system where we are more capable of handling virus and bacteria. It's not pro-inflammatory like it is in the high hormone phase. We're also seeing increase in our heart rate variability, so we have better recovery metrics. So when we're looking at that low hormone phase, being able to load in there, like with more plyometric work, higher loads, we have better recovery. And again, it depends on how the woman feels. So that overlay of the qualitative understanding your own cycle is so important, rather than just looking at the quantitative, oh, here are our ratios of estrogen and progesterone. So when you're looking at designing a periodized program, knowing where they are in their cycle is one thing, but also overlaying that qualitative, how am I feeling? What are my perceptions is so important.
How do those, a lot of those changes, the hormonal changes you're discussing, relate to the risk of ACL injuries during the phase, with the fluctuations effects on perhaps some of the connective tissues, ligaments, and tendons?
Yeah, so this conversation came up the other day, and I'm fully in the camp when you start looking at the research and understanding what's going on with ACL. One of my PhD students just defended looking at ACL rehabilitation based on menstrual cycle. And so we've really been digging into it, and it really comes down to the loading. So if you're not appropriately loading the woman at times when she can take that stress versus when her body's not so great, then of course you're going to have some kind of soft tissue injury. People assume that ovulation is associated with ACL tear, but there's not a lot of robust information when you start looking at training loads leading up to any kind of soft tissue injury, and you're overlaying that in the ACL tear, it comes up to be training load. And people just assume, oh, well, it's because I was around ovulation, that's why I have this tissue. But estrogen in itself, yes, it makes things more lax, but from a survival standpoint, the body's not going to create an environment where the female of the species is capable of being killed, captured and killed by the beast. So there's an associative response to laxity that estrogen creates, with some more neuromuscular aspects of tightening tendons and tightening muscles. So they're in a better holding pattern. And when we think about the force velocity curve, and you're thinking about, okay, there's that pre-sprung of the muscle, which might also allow for faster firing rate and more dynamic movement. it's part of that intrinsic, okay, estrogen's making things more lax, but then we have this control of the muscle that's making things a bit tighter. So it makes sense when you're looking from that muscular standpoint and the molecular standpoint that now all of a sudden we have this kind of primer for being able to do more high intense, fast firing plyometric type. I see Pat's nodding his head. Yeah. Okay. Makes sense. I got it.
Well, I'll just admit it. Like, I don't really got it, like, on this topic. Like, this isn't an area of expertise for mine. So, like, when I asked you earlier and I said, like, what are 3 things that recommendations you can make that people could apply tomorrow? But just prior to that, you gave like a precursor and say, hey, it's having conversations about all these different topics and issues under this umbrella. And then Pat said, he's like, Ernie sits in on a lot of our health and performance team meetings. And like, I sit in on health and performance team meetings for numerous sports at our institution. And several of those are women's teams with women's coaches. And I'll tell you that in the little over 2 years that I've been working here, I won't say that the menstrual cycle has never come up, but it rarely does. So when we talk about things like, I've heard estimates from our physicians on like what percentage of athletes are using like ADHD medication, but the conversation of like what percentage are using OCs versus other forms of contraception, like these conversations just don't come up. So I guess like what I'm like coming back to it, like I don't really got it. I know Pat's nodding his head, but I don't really got it. So how do we, there's probably some male and female, like some gender vulnerabilities here. Maybe men don't feel as comfortable talking about the issue as others, but how do we normalize this conversation in our setting?
Yeah. So we had that issue here in New Zealand. And we put together a working group specific to look at women's health issues. And one of the first things that we did is we put out a survey to all the female athletes, just trying to get a handle on what their past menstrual cycle health was, what their perceptions were, what kind of OCs they used. And because it was all de-identified, we just got a really good schematic and idea of what was going on. And from there, we were able to share with medical staff and say, hey, these are the areas that we're all failing in, and these are the areas where we should see improvement. So that really opened up the conversation between the sports science teams, the sociologists, and the medical, to be able to understand the sporting culture, what were some of the beliefs, how women were perceiving their training, and how menstrual cycle affected it. Most of them didn't know what low energy availability was. Most of them didn't know that using an OC was not the same as. So that was an opportunity to see what needed to be educated to the female athletes. And then the physicians were like, oh, now we see we have to go back to basics because these women don't know anything. And they're just looking at Instagram influencers or teammates for information. So it gave the opportunity to kind of have a reset. And so then we had the science team conveying the same information as the medical team with regards to what are some of these really specific health markers we need to be aware of, specifically around low energy availability and injury prevention. But then it also made physicians aware that there was a really high percentage of PCOS, which we see in a lot of female athletes, especially those who are successful in power and strength-based sports because of higher androgenicity. So then they were able to reach out and be like, okay, we see this higher incidence of PCOS, let's use more screening. So I think the opportunity to open up that conversation, you have to take, here's your project, Ernie. You have to create a questionnaire or use some of the ones that are in the literature already and de-identify and just get that baseline information, which is really hard. Or you could open it up and say, hey, we're just wondering about our female athletes, want to do better. As physicians, what are you seeing? And then ask, if you know ADHD medications, ask them about OCs. If they don't know, then maybe it's an opportunity to push and be like, hey, maybe we should just do a deep dive and just to find out.
Thank you. And like, So one issue we have in the field of strength conditioning, for instance, in the United States, is that we have a lot more male strength conditioning coaches than we do female strength conditioning
That's
coaches.
across the board, though. That's across the world. That's across the board. Yeah.
And so, and to go a little bit further, like, what do female athletes say, like, when their male coaches talk about the menstrual cycle? And like, is there like, because I actually perceive that maybe there's a hesitancy or a lack of comfort by male staff to be able to just be able to have a conversation about this like they would any other topic in human physiology and exercise physiology. But it just seems like we avoid this topic.
And it is definitely an age thing. Because if we think about what our parents and what we were exposed to as kids in health class and stuff, right? We weren't really exposed to it, and we were all pushed to that time of the month. Girls don't want to talk about it. But we're finding in the younger set, university set, the women are already talking about it. And the younger coaching staff already feels comfortable because they've heard it through high school, because it's become such a global conversation in the past few years. So unfortunately, and I fit myself in there, it's an ageist thing. Like, we're uncomfortable because we've grown up with it being a taboo. We're finding the younger sets like, it's okay, because the women are more comfortable talking about it. So that perception is unfortunately in our generation. So we just have to be like, okay, yeah, it's uncomfortable. Like, I'll admit, I'll go into a room full of older rugby coaches to give a presentation on the female athlete, and I feel a little bit sticky when I'm talking about menstrual cycle. And I should, because I talk about it almost every day. But it's just knowing that we all have this kind of same taboo-ness that we all grew up with. So we just kind of have to like shift perspective and be like, it's a little bit uncomfortable, but it's probably uncomfortable for me, not so much for them. Especially if we're looking at our 17, 18, 19, 20-year-old group that has grown up with that conversation, has seen professional female athletes talking about it openly.
So you're saying get with the times?
Yeah, maybe. Just understand our own backgrounds and why we're uncomfortable around it. Or get with the times,
Nice.
Ernie, you said something earlier about the health and performance meetings, and I thought about another interesting, maybe complication with talking about it openly. And I have a meeting with our general counsel this week, but there are political implications when talking about contraception and how do you do it, and then legal, we have to get advice from our legal counsel on what we do, what policies what are best practices. So it's not just it's different than some other topics that we talk about because of the politics involved.
Yes.
With it.
Very polarized in the States at the moment. This whole thing is very polarized. It's just frustrating that politics come into women's health, but that's a different conversation on a different day.
Yeah.
So yeah, working through those nuances would be a new stumbling block for me, because I'm like, well, what do you mean I can't talk about this? So that would be something that you'd have to bring up. You can probably most likely discuss it in your group meetings, but then how do you translate it into on the floor, right? So that policy discussion is going to have to be inherently part of what you are discussing, and what can you say? Because I also, although I have a very strong American accent, I've been out of the American system for many years. So I think about the liability aspects if you do a misstep. All those things are just now coming rushing back. So yeah, you guys are unfortunately going to have those conversations, and then see as a group, what are we going to do to be able to translate that, to be able to have these open health conversations? Maybe it's not necessarily saying you shouldn't be using that oral contraceptive pill when you're on the gym floor. It's like doing the health scan and the check. And then if there is something that comes up, then it could be red flagged, where they go talk to the physician and you recommend, hey, how about a health check?
That makes sense. I'm just thinking about how many people need to hear your message?
I'll shout it loud. I'll be on a billboard. I don't live in New Zealand. I mean, I don't live in the States yet, so it's okay.
And you talk about the times. One of my daughters just had an open conversation with me, and I was caught off guard. I wasn't. It's like,
Oh.
you just told me, okay, sounds good. I was just thinking, for my sister, would she have ever? And my sister and my dad are super close. I can't ever imagine in a million years her ever saying anything to my dad about what was going on with her.
I couldn't imagine that saying anything to my dad either, right? And that comes down to our generation, right? I'm really excited to hear that your daughter felt comfortable to be able to tell you stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
I felt like I was special. Trusted me.
You are. That's a good relationship right there.
That was pretty awesome.
And soon enough, with enough study in this area and learning from people like Stacy, you'll just be like, oh, well, it's time to go do some power training. Let's go right now.
Some facts. That's excellent. Ted, what do you think about this? You spend majority of your time with male athletes, male-dominated sport, but you're a scientist. So what do you think about this?
Oh, I do a lot of reviewing of the literature on the female athlete because it fascinates me since I'm the only male in my family, wife and, 2 daughters. So, but the one thing that I found interesting, I was reading a study and it was with professional ballerinas who had stopped menstruating, and they tracked them for 1 week when they were on vacation. And body composition didn't change over the course of the week, but their menstrual cycle returned after this week, this hiatus on vacation. And I also remember reading that during the Civil War in the United States, that a lot of women stopped menstruating. So if you look at the impact of extreme psychological stress, is it a built-in survival mechanism where the body's saying this is probably not the best time to get pregnant? So, what have you found anything in this area? And because a lot of times when you look at the landscape of high competition elite athletes, there is a tremendous amount of psychological stress. And sometimes we focus on the physiological overload of the body. And I think sometimes the psychological effects of stress may get overlooked. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, we see this, like I can look at menstrual cycle changes and pick out when athletes have been traveling and when they've been at home training because of differences in menstrual cycle, or who hasn't had a cycle, who's been late. And part of it is chronobiology, where we're looking at time zone shifts, but also like if the ballerinas are on vacation, maybe now they're on their own time zone and they're eating more, or maybe not more, but they're eating more according to the output they have. So their body's like, oh, there's nutrition coming in. I can restart luteinizing hormone pulse and I can, period. And then we're looking at like Civil War, tactical athletes, under high stress conditions. Yeah, definitely. The more cortisol and the less slow wave sleep you have interrupts appetite. It interrupts luteinizing hormone pulse, interrupts the circadian pulses of estrogen. And then in the high hormone phase, if they ovulate, progesterone, see changes in testosterone pulse as well. All these can feed back to the hypothalamus. And in the hypothalamus, the kisspeptin neurons, we know that there's 2 areas for women and 1 area for men, and kisspeptin is responsible for appetite as well as endocrine health. So we're getting these perturbances in pulses, then the kisspeptin neurons will downturn and downregulate, which will stop menstrual cycle. So stress is a huge thing. And even if we're seeing women who are having a regular cycle, whether or not they're ovulatory or not is something else that we're seeing that we need to be aware of in the sporting environment under high stress. Because, more and more in ovulatory cycles, less and less progesterone, changes of the menstrual cycle length, then that's, the precursor to amenorrhea. But stress, huge implications. because we think about changes in our sleep patterns, we see changes in parasympathetic responses, all of the things that allow functionality of the endocrine system are impacted. And I think that's why I get frustrated with some of the messaging that's coming specifically out of sports science and messaging that's coming from meta-analyses and systematic reviews that get into popular media, where they're completely discounting so much of the female athlete population because they're only specifically looking at a very small area of research that doesn't include female athletes who are traveling or tactical athletes, or the qualitative aspect. There's no qualitative aspect in these conversations. But when it's being pushed out, this is where I get frustrated because it doesn't take that person into account. It doesn't take stress into account. And that's why I'm like, yeah, we're moving forward, but in some senses, we're moving backwards. And that's what's frustrating. Ernie's unmuted.
My mind's blown right now.
Huh.
Thank
Sorry,
you.
or good. I
Oh,
don't
that's
know.
what we signed up for.
Awesome.
What question do you have for us? Because we're close to wrapping it up here. What question do you have for us?
I have this problem when people ask me that because I don't know, I'm just trying to get information out, and to see that you guys are acting on it is great. Like, to me, that's a win. So that's exciting. And if I can help like disseminate down or give you some step points to keep pushing the messaging forward, I love that. And I think we've done that today. So just, yeah, I don't have any questions really, other than, let's just keep pushing forward a little bit at a time, and understanding the person as well as what the science is saying. Because, I mean, you see this big discrepancy where you have full lab people and they're doing all the lab tests, but then they don't understand us who are applied people. And we have to do boots on the ground and understand the person. And that's where, like I said, I feel like some of us are being pushed backwards, and in some regards, we're having these conversations that are moving us forward. But for those of us that are applied, if we put our boots on the ground and really keep pushing forward in the applied space, it's going to be so beneficial, not only for our female athletes, but also for general population and our daughters. Like, my drive now is for my daughter.
Okay, Dr. Sims, for our listeners, aside from your book, and please mention your book to our listeners, what are some other reading recommendations do you have for them?
So book-wise, our second edition of Roar is coming out on the 6th of January. So it's been updated from a scientific standpoint and biohacking standpoint, because, science evolves. And then our website and Instagram, we put out messaging and articles and stuff on almost daily basis, and we have free blogs and newsletters. But then we look other resources like Abby Smith's Ryan, where Sam Moore is right now at UNC, doing a lot of really good applied work, and her website and her lab has really good information. We see that also with Catherine Ackerman's group outside of or in Boston at Boston Children's Hospital and the WUSI Alliance, where they're having a really good push for information and education on the female athlete. They're more of a clinical scope, looking at how to prevent low energy availability and how to prevent bone stress and that kind of stuff. But it's always a good start. And then there are different NSOs that are doing coaching, continuing education, looking at menstrual cycle, what is normal, what is not. So just investigating your own NSO is going to be helpful too.
Well, I can't believe how fast the time went by. I feel like we can go for another hour. I'm going to shut it off.
Open up the conversation.
We're going to shut it down right now. It's been a pleasure, Dr. Sims. Thank you so much for your time and the knowledge and just blowing Dr. Reimer's mind. We appreciate that.
No worries. Happy to help.
Yeah.
Great to
Yeah.
chat with you guys
Thank
too.
you.
Thanks.
Andy, thank you.
Thank you. Take care and have a great day.
Yeah, you too.